Hey everyone, welcome to another expert panel with MIT Enterprise Forum New York. My name is Gen, and I head our chapter here in New York. Before we begin the main event, let me just tell you a bit about our organization, MIT Enterprise Forum. We're a volunteer-based nonprofit with chapters from around the world, and as the biggest chapter outside of Cambridge, our New York chapter has been serving the technology and entrepreneurs community here in New York and around the country for the last 40 years. We host about 2 to 3 events a month by now on various topics, ranging from expert panels like this one to panel on cryptocurrency to fireside chat with industry leaders and workshops. You can learn more about us and our membership program from our website. Now, without further ado, let me introduce tonight's moderator, Ned. Ned Lomigora is a board member of MIT Enterprise Forum of New York and CEO of Cape Ann Tech, serving leading startups and Fortune 500 companies. He's a serial entrepreneur and MIT graduate, where his research at AI Lab led to the formation of MIT Auto ID Lab. Ned, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your wonderful introduction, gang. And I have to say, I'm very excited about tonight's event. We have an amazing group of panelists for you, all with direct and unique experience in innovation and entrepreneurship, both in developing economies as well as here in the United States. We have audience from all over the world as well. Many are from European countries, a lot of them Bosnians who immigrated there. Then we have Australia. And of course, people from many cities in the United States. We have seen the rise in innovation and entrepreneurship across the globe in many developing nations, and we have all heard great success stories. The impact of innovation and entrepreneurship on the economy and society comes in many forms, from increases in productivity, higher competitiveness, job creation, but also secondary impacts such as investment in infrastructure, protection of the environment, higher political stability, more social inclusion, and the list goes on. However, entrepreneurs in countries with a low GDP, as well as many parts of the United States, do not have adequate access to resources to enable them to innovate and start ventures. Tonight, we will examine different models and examples of how this situation can be improved, and hopefully how some lessons learned in developing economies could be applied to underdeveloped parts of the United States. So it's my distinct honor to introduce tonight's panel. Dina Sheriff is an executive director of MIT Legatum Center and senior lecturer at Sloan School of Management. Dina is also a senior advisor to Ashoka, providing support to their Global Venture Fellowship. Dina formerly held the endowed Willard Brown Chair for International Business at the American University in Cairo, where she was also founding director at the Center for Entrepreneurship. Dina holds Masters of Public Administration and Management from Harvard Kennedy School and Masters in Economic Development Studies and Bachelor's in Political Science and International Relations from the American University of Cairo. As United States Ambassador, Eric Nelson is leading the United States government's efforts to advance its security partnership with Bosnia Herzegovina and economic prosperity, combat corruption, and strengthen the rule of law. Ambassador Nelson previously served as Deputy Executive Secretary and Director of the Executive Office of the Executive Secretariat, Director of the Office of E-Diplomacy, Deputy Chief of Mission in Costa Rica, and Consul General in Munich, as well as overseas in Islamabad, Milan, Mexico City, Frankfurt, Santo Domingo, and in Washington in the Bureau of Administration. In 2014, he was selected by FedScoop magazine as one of 14 visionary leaders in federal information technology. Elizabeth McBride is an award-winning business journalist and the founder of Times of Entrepreneurship. She's the host of the upcoming Sparked, a new podcast featuring interviews of the world's leading entrepreneurs. Her work has been funded by Ewing Marion Kaufman Foundation and Aspen Institute's Socrates program. She's a former fellow at Georgetown's Big Center for Social Impact and Innovation. Elizabeth was a writing fellow at the UN's Office of the Quartet in Jerusalem. Her works appeared in Atlantic, Forbes, Newsweek, The Washington Post, Quartz, and HBO. Edhem Eddie Trustovic is a professor of engineering at La Trobe University, Australia, founder director of the Electronic Innovation and Entrepreneurship Foundry, founder of IEEE Innovation, and co-founder of Scientific Instruments Australia. In 2015, he founded the Bosnia and Herzegovina Futures Foundation. The foundation's vision is to break down ethnic division in his homeland through a simple approach of empowering youth through education, technology, access, and leadership development. Justovic currently serves as the IEEE chair of the Industry Engagement Committee, where he engages with C-level executives and Fortune 500 organizations. In 2015, Justovic was recognized for his outstanding leadership and received the IEEE Young Professionals Achievement Award. Barry L. Shoup is a dean of the Albert Narkin School of Engineering at Cooper Union. He retired as a brigadier general from a 38-year career in the U.S. Army, where he served in a number of key roles at the U.S. Military Academy West Point. He is a fellow of the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the Optical Society of America, and the International Society for Optical Engineering. In 2016, Dr. Shoup served as the IEEE President and CEO. In 2008, Optical Society of America recognized him with their Robert E. Hopkins Leadership Award. Dr. Shoup holds a patent on photonic analog to digital conversion and has authored over 150 publications as well as 8 books. Now let's get into the panel discussion. During the first part, I will ask 2 rounds of prepared questions for everybody so we can get more familiar with the background and work of each of our panelists. And after that, we will go into an open discussion. I encourage participants and attendees to write questions into the chat during the first part, and we will get to as many questions as we can into the second part. So Dina, let me start with you. This is your quote from an article written by the Times of Entrepreneurs. The world is facing a multitude of problems, including unemployment, climate change, poor regulatory environments, injustice, inequality, inadequate infrastructure in rural areas, and the list goes on. All of these challenges stand in the way of global prosperity. Question, can you give us some examples of how Legatum Center empowers entrepreneurs in developing economies to tackle some of these issues?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. I think first I have to thank Elizabeth for quoting me in that article. Times of Entrepreneurship is a great platform. I highly recommend that everybody subscribe and follow the articles, the amazing articles she writes. So the Legatum Center was created over 12 years ago with the purpose of promoting entrepreneurship as a pathway to achieving prosperity. So I think in general, when we think about prosperity or development, our minds go towards the World Bank, the United Nations, what big foundations like the Ford Foundation are doing. When in actuality, we should really be thinking about how entrepreneurship can help to solve those problems and achieve prosperity. So at the center, we do a number of different things. So our main flagship program is our student fellowship program. And that basically supports students who are studying at MIT, who are starting businesses within emerging markets that are solving major challenges. We provide them with a scholarship, and they have to attend a special class that really works with them to prepare them for when they return to those emerging markets or are ready to roll out the business models in emerging markets. I'm also about to launch a new fellowship that will support entrepreneurs who have gone through the full entrepreneurial journey. So entrepreneurs who have actually gotten to growth or scale in Africa to also become Legatum Fellows, to take a moment to step back and reflect on what they've done up until this point with their businesses and how they can step into the broader entrepreneurial ecosystem as leaders, either by moving into the space of venture capital or by creating new support organizations or by starting a new business. But essentially, we do want to provide them with the space to take a step back and think about what role they want to play next. We also do a lot of work around thought leadership and research. Elizabeth still is a journalist in residence at the Legatum Center. But we do that through a number. We have a lot of working papers that will be coming out into, over the upcoming months, case studies. We have a blog post. We do a number of webinars like these to raise awareness on the importance of entrepreneurship in emerging markets. And then also we'll be launching a number of new initiatives in Africa that include capacity building and training programs, one in collaboration with the Clay Christensen Institute that will be working with entrepreneurs on how they can unlock new markets through innovation and really tap into the base of the pyramid as consumers through their businesses. But we'll also be doing a number of workshops around systems change entrepreneurship as well.
Great. Thank you for that intro. Ambassador Nelson, first of all, thank you so much for staying up so late to be with us. It's past midnight in Sarajevo, where I'm assuming you are. During your tenure in Bosnia, you have been recognized for working very diligently to implement various development initiatives, both through USAID and the organization you started yourself called BOLT. Can you please tell us more about these activities and what are the key indicators you use to measure success?
Well, thank you, Ned. It's a pleasure to join you all. It is a quiet night here in Sarajevo. The U.S. has been firmly committed to Bosnia and Herzegovina's ability to rebuild itself after the horrific war of the 1990s. And that assistance has already surpassed $2 billion, largely managed by USAID. In the early years, that was assistance that was rebuilding the country, bridges, schools, infrastructure, electric capacity, banking institutions. And in more recent years, we're focusing more and more on growing the true private sector here, supporting entrepreneurs, supporting SMEs. The reason that that's so important is because the economy overall is captured largely by more than 500 state-owned enterprises and a very large public sector. So these organizations are controlled by the political parties, and the opportunity for especially young people is therefore very limited. The result is that Bosnia and Herzegovina has the third highest brain drain of any country, of all countries in the world, according to the World Economic Forum, surpassed only by Haiti and Venezuela. So creating real jobs, creating real opportunity in a true private sector is a top priority of the US government. And we do that in largely through USAID and other agency grants, targeting what we see as promising sectors. One of the projects that's been especially fruitful is called Diaspora Invest, which encourages returnees. There's 2 million Bosnian Herzegovinians in diaspora compared to 3 million here. A significant number of them are interested in coming back and starting businesses. Diaspora Invest helps them tap credit, which is otherwise not accessible to them, helps them find opportunities, helps them grow their companies. It's created hundreds of jobs and generated millions of dollars in investment in the country. Another activity we have is supporting tourism. We see that as especially promising sector for SME opportunity. We're also the manufacturing and IT sectors are very favorable, and we've been quite active in the agricultural sector, helping small producers and medium-sized producers increase their capacity, especially their capacity to achieve access to the EU market, start exporting, especially in the dairy, poultry, and fruit sectors, and even beekeepers. So That's a lot of the business support that USAID is doing. USAID is doing. You mentioned also the BOLD program. BOLD is a program that we launched last year. It's BOLD, it stands for Beha Omladinski Lideri, which in local language means Young BIH, Bosnia Herzegovina Leaders. And our intent here, again, was to counter the brain drain, to support the young people who are saying, I don't want to have to leave the country to get a good job, which so many of them are. I would like to stay here and take control of my future. And BOLD supports them, those who are between 18 and 35, by offering them activities in 2 tracks. One is civic activism, which can also be called social entrepreneurship, and the other is entrepreneurialism. We offer fellowships in the United States. We offer workshops in country. We offer small grants and mentoring connections to help these young people develop and grow their leadership skills. So BOLD has been a big hit. We've already got 2,600 young people subscribed, and they're tremendous. All of these entrepreneurs are really inspiring to me in a country that's very difficult, where the business environment is very difficult. It's wonderful to be able to support people who have the resilience and the grit to really succeed. And there's a strong minority of people like that here in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then USAID even has more programs that target women entrepreneurs, working with local governments, where we match their grants to women who want to start a business. I travel around the country a lot. Some of my most fun visits have been to some of the women who have started their enterprise, whether it was a hair salon or a creperie or an artisanal cheese production business. So we try to cover the whole range, and I could go on and on. You asked about how we measure success through constant monitoring, constant evaluation, through assessment of which programs are effective, which are not adapting to the current conditions, which are producing poor results, and how can we retarget our approaches. And we're always looking for measures, whether it's number of jobs created, exports increased, or even measures like number of parafiscal fees eliminated. In our work with the government to improve the business environment, we've already encouraged, helped them eliminate 51 parafiscal fees. That's now the elimination of those fees are saving entrepreneurs and businesses millions of euros a year.
Great. Thank you, Ambassador. Elizabeth, you have experience covering entrepreneurship both in developing economies and the middle United States. So I have 2 questions for you. Have you seen some similarities in issues that are standing in the way of entrepreneurs in both developing economies and the middle United States? And on the flip side, what are some common factors that you observe that contribute to the success and growth of entrepreneurship in both?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for having me. And I do just want to note, I am a journalist in residence at the Legatum Center and loved my position there and meeting the fantastic fellows that are there. And so enjoy and so regret the fact that my year at MIT was sort of messed up by the pandemic. But we're all facing with those issues now, including many of the entrepreneurs that I'm covering now in the middle of the US. So I would tell you that there's more in common in the middle of the US and developing economies than most Americans for sure realize, and probably than most people around the world realize. What I found is that generally the spirit of entrepreneurship that exists around the world is the biggest common factor, right? It's this determination to solve problems and carve your own future that I think most people it's a common language that people speak in entrepreneurship around the world. I think what people would find shocking is that in the middle of the United States, which people think of as a very wealthy country, the period after the Great Recession was marked by a real sort of a scissors in the economic development of the US. About 20% of our metro areas went up, and about 80% of them went down. And that was because most of the jobs and most of the entrepreneurship happened in a few big cities on both coasts, and the surrounding suburbs and smaller cities around those. And they're the obvious candidates, right? New York and Boston. Miami was sort of surged into the picture there, but it left the economies in the middle of the US really behind. And because of that, there's a lot of work to be done there, right? So that the infrastructure that exists on both coasts does not exist so much for the bulk of the US population and so many of the people in the middle of the US. In terms of the barriers, this is something that I really wanted to mention. I've been working on a book called The New Builders, which is exactly about this topic of resparking entrepreneurship in the US. Because the other thing that people don't realize is that even though we're a country of we think of ourselves as entrepreneurial, in fact, entrepreneurship has been on a 30-year decline in the US. So that's something that's very different, right? Declining in the US, I've seen it on the rise everywhere else in developing economies. So it's a big difference. And I would say that the barriers in the developing parts of the US, in the middle of the US, are shared though with the developing economies, and that what you see is that there's a real capital gap, but the most important piece of the capital gap comes even before people launch a company. So that you need a certain amount of resources to have the time and space and energy to think of a business idea, to put in that initial 6 months of work, or it might be 10 years of work, right? Depending on who you are and what you're thinking about. And you need space and time, and you also need the confidence that comes from having a financial safety net to do that. And that's really the big piece that I see missing for entrepreneurs in developing economies everywhere. Fixing that's a complicated proposition, right? I think it's certainly much better in countries that have a big social safety net, which we lack here and which many developing economies also lack. The other thing that I see in common is that many developing economies and in the US, we're marked very much by disparities and by divisions between communities, so that the people who are the most entrepreneurial, and that is people of color in the United States, it's women, it's immigrants, and that's the same all around the world. Those people are the very people who are told, you're less worthy, you can't do it. So that's a second battle that has to be fought in most developing economies. You've got to figure out ways to help people gain that confidence and feel that self-esteem and feel that they've got somebody at their back. That if they try to launch and it doesn't work, there will be another launch in the future. So I hope that was helpful.
That was very helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you. We'll talk more about that actually. And Eddie, you started the Bosnia and Herzegovina Futures Foundation in 2015, and then a few years later, you started, when you started IEEE Innovation Nation, you were able to replicate this grassroots volunteer program that you started with the Futures Foundation, which has been a very big success. And you were able to transport that to other countries such as Jamaica, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Central Africa, and you're in the process of expanding into others as well. Can you please explain what are the major components that constitute this program, and give us some detail about how they're implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, Ned, and really enjoying this discussion here. So I'll start off by saying I have two volunteering passions and love. One is the IEEE, which is the Institute of Electrical Electronic Engineers. And just for everyone on call and everyone that's on the panel here, IEEE has over 440,000 members in 180 plus countries. So it's truly a global organization. And because that particular organization is very closely tied to my professional pathway, in which I also met Professor Brigadier General Barry Shoup, I guess I was looking for ways that I could leverage this enormous network of volunteers, people who share a common goal. And IEEE's mission is advancing technology for humanity. And that plays a very close role with what we started in Bosnia. And I'll explain how the two tie together and why that particular model is also working well now in other countries where we're expanding Innovation Nation. So in Bosnia, we started Bosnia Herzegovina Futures Foundation with a goal, as you mentioned, of breaking down this ethnic division, which has plagued the country for at least 25 plus years, perhaps even longer. But the two fuse together by looking at what IEEE's core mission is and where IEEE's strengths lie. So the network is a strength. But I started thinking about why isn't IEEE exploiting, or let's say further exploring its entrepreneurial spirit? Because every single one of the members in IEEE, especially those that have a little bit more experience, are researchers, developing engineers, professionals in industry. So naturally, they have an entrepreneurial spirit. They're definitely innovative. So we looked at ways how to leverage that particular experience and be able to share it with these developing economies by empowering them, by giving them the resources, by giving them the tool sets and the skills to be able to solve problems at a local level. And by creating Bosnia Herzegovina Futures Foundation and tackling that from a youth perspective, we're essentially empowering the next generation of change makers. And these young individuals connected to this global brain that IEEE is, are able to then leverage this intellectual property, this lifelong experience of many members that have had vast experiences across the world, and then be able to sort of push that in their own pathway and solve their own problems at a local level. So Innovation Nation started in 2015 with exactly that goal in mind. We tried to tackle these issues that were prevalent in Bosnia, but then quickly realized they exist in many countries around the world. And I'm glad that Elizabeth mentioned the US, because I've also experienced this in parts of Australia where I currently live and work, that although we can look at a country from a macro level and say, yep, it has a good GDP and therefore everyone's living well, we know that there are pockets of excellence in every country, and there are also pockets that are really struggling. And parts of the US are in that position as well. So we picked on a couple of these metrics and we said low GDP per capita, high youth unemployment, which the ambassador also mentioned, is one of the driving factors of why we wanted to put such a big focus on innovation entrepreneurship. It's about creating new jobs rather than just backfilling those public service positions that are available in countries like Bosnia and other developing economies. So they get saturated, and that puts a huge drain on the budget of the entire nation, and therefore it's not sustainable long term. So Innovation Nation is essentially a program that has a 10-week accelerated development time in which we take, let's say, some of the brightest and most motivated young people in the country, and we put them through a rigorous 10-week boot camp, if you like. This year it's been online, last year was a hybrid, but we put them through that course to empower them and give them the skills that their counterparts in other more developed economies, let's say highly valuable institutions, have access to, and provide them then with the capital and the resources, the mentorship, the exclusive information they need to be able to take that next step moving forward. And the program has had a lot of success in a very short time frame. You mentioned a few countries on that list there. I can always say Sri Lanka was the next one to follow suit and say, we want to follow this model. We now have this cooperation between these two countries and others that are in the program. And what's been fantastic is that young people in these countries can really understand what one country has gone through, but also benchmark it against a country that is to some extent on par with the development in that particular nation where they live. So sharing those experiences has been wonderful, and the success has been growing year in, year out. And obviously the program is now expanding to about 10 countries. It's probably going to expand to about 20 countries next year. And we're definitely looking forward to collaborating with other institutions to see how we can seed that level of knowledge in developing economies and help accelerate the development by working with the entire ecosystem, which also includes the government, local government, education institutions, financing institutions. It's the entire ecosystem. And I'm sure Professor Shoup will talk about the ecosystem in a minute and probably enlighten us all about what it takes to create that.
Thanks, Eddie. Of course, General Shoup, so in your work, that I studied extensively, you point that the growth of innovation can be both encouraged or impeded by social, political, and even religious influences. So can you please provide us some examples of both types of this influence that you've encountered in different countries you've been to?
Sure. Thank you, Ned, for the invitation to participate here. It's an honor to be with this group, and it's a fascinating discussion. So let me confess up front that I am a technologist, and I have been a technologist my entire life. I'm an electrical engineer. I got into innovation probably around 2007. In 2006, I was selected as the chief technology officer for a brand new startup organization, if you will, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the United States. And our charge, we were given a whole bunch of money, and our charge was to solve the improvised explosive device problem worldwide. And so I got an opportunity there to see an awful lot of innovation and entrepreneurship in terms of technology development. And so I went back to West Point after that, and I actually started a course on innovation for the cadets at West Point to try to infuse that entrepreneurship and innovation into future leaders for the Army and for the nation. And early on, I was very focused on the product, the end device as a technologist. And what I quickly learned was that even though I love technology and technology is always the end solution to any problem that we have, there's a human dimension. And as Ned said, there's a social, political, and religious aspect to it. So if you were to think about this from the perspective of a Venn diagram, and if you overlay the social, political, economic, religious, and technological aspects of what you're trying to solve, it is that intersection of those that Venn diagram is where your true innovation occurs. And so it was a number of years later, in fact, I was focused on the products. When I was the IEEE president, I was giving a lecture at Oxford, and I was asked the question, how does the European Union go about creating a Silicon Valley? And I didn't, at the time, I didn't have an answer for that. And so it caused me to think, come back and do some studying. And so at that point, I began expanding what I was looking at from the product to geographic regions, as well as countries, nation states. And if you were to look at this, there is, as Eddie said, there's an ecosystem here that needs to be fed in order to have a successful innovation hub, if you will. And the kinds of things that go into that are things like a university or several universities, arts and culture. You've heard a little bit about diversity of opinion. So it's not getting a whole bunch of electrical engineers in the room. It's getting philosophers and chemists and psychologists and others thinking about the problem. A confluence of artisans, if you will, startups and larger companies in the local area, gathering places, things like Starbucks, baristas, food, and pubs where people get together and share ideas. Financial infusion is an important aspect. And you heard earlier from the ambassador, things like regulatory freedom is an important element. And if you were to study different areas, you can, history is replete with this, and you can go all the way back to the 15th century Florence and look at, that was the birthplace of the Renaissance. And if you were to look at the kinds of things that were at work there in Florence, you had a university there, and the university draws young people, it draws diverse disciplinary backgrounds. There was an arts and culture center, social gathering centers. The Medici family was actually the financial infusion for Florence at the time. And the Medici family ruled and regulated Florence. And so in terms of regulatory freedom, there was, that ecosystem was at work. I'll share Silicon Valley as a compare and contrast. So Silicon Valley, you can look at the universities in the local area. I myself from Stanford. One could argue that maybe Berkeley is part of that, but we won't go there because of the Stanford-Berkeley rival. But but there's a confluence of startups and large companies there. The universities are there. There's lots of financial infusion going on. And in terms of the regulatory aspect of it, what I would say is it only takes you to go back and look at New Jersey and look at Bell Labs, which is where William Shockley invented the transistor. You know, the question to be asked is, why wasn't New Jersey the Silicon Valley? And it turns out that New Jersey had regulatory oppression in terms of this entrepreneurship and startup. And so it actually forced Shockley to go to California and begin what he was doing. And so all of those things play into the ecosystem. You can even abstract that larger. Boston is obviously an innovation hub. Where I'm at in Manhattan, New York has been labeled Silicon Alley. You can expand that and you can look at places like Israel and even Singapore. And so when you look at all of these are in fact the kind of the elements of the ecosystem. Now, everything that I've mentioned so far has been developed nations, and I'm pretty confident that we'll come back and we'll talk about how we implement and how we do that in developing nations.
Well, so I will go back in reverse. So, Jen, I will start with you again. I'll just give you a straight question right after this one. You had just mentioned that these certain key elements, such as presence of a big university, arts and culture, gathering centers, willingness to invest, less stringent regulations, etc., can act as an impetus to boost innovation and to innovation and entrepreneurship. Are there certain key elements that IEEE Innovation Nation model either implements or helps develop in these emerging economies as well?
Yeah, and again, you know, it's taking me a while. I haven't flushed this out completely in my own mind, but as I think about the required elements of an ecosystem and I look at what the Innovation Nation is implementing, in developing nations, you may or may not have all of these different elements to support the ecosystem. So I see Innovation Nation, as I talked to Eddie about the implementation of it, I see educational resources being brought to bear. And you know, forgive my language, my background, but I come from a military background, so we talk about power projection, you know, moving things forward. And I see Innovation Nation as a projection ability, a projection platform that brings to bear education for, you know, what is entrepreneurship, what is innovation, how do you go about doing this? So there's an educational component to it, which is what you would get from a university. So raising the awareness of entrepreneurship and innovation within a country. You have more and more people that understand what that is, they want that. You know, with IEEE is a very technology heavy kind of a professional society, so you can bring to bear technical experts in a wide variety of different areas within disciplines. So if you are a young student in Bosnia and you have a passion for doing artificial intelligence or machine learning in a projection kind of a format, there are experts from around the world that can in fact provide that. Teaching about the ecosystem, Eddie graciously invites me every time he runs one of these to talk about what the ecosystem is, and you know, understanding the ecosystem. Like the ambassador said, there's regulatory aspects to this. So, you know, the ambassador is clearly not a technology person, but understanding that the regulatory aspect of the government can either encourage or suppress this innovation is important to understand. And financing, obviously, they bring external financiers into this. So I see it as a way to take a geographic region that may not have all of those elements. And as long as you know what elements are needed, you can in fact provide those elements to help support that. So I'm encouraged. It's an experiment. You know, the initial results look very promising. I look forward to following it.
Ned, if I may, can I just build a little bit?
Yeah.
You know, being Egyptian and from an emerging market, I feel I do have to say a few words. I think, you know, when you're thinking about, I don't necessarily prefer to use the term developing countries anymore, because the bulk of economic growth is actually really happening in Africa and Southeast Asia and Latin America. So we say emerging markets or growth markets because GDP growth is by far exceeding what we're seeing in the United States and Europe right now. And I say this because I think we often look at emerging markets as, you know, places that are lagging behind. And while that may be the case, I do think that what is happening now, as many citizens in these countries realize that governments are not the solution to a lot of the challenges they face, and also neither is the World Bank or the United Nations or a number of other multilaterals the solution to the problems they face. And I think what we're seeing is a growing group of young people who are really taking things into their own hands and using entrepreneurship and innovation as a tool to solve these challenges. I think it's important to recognize that entrepreneurship is something in the sense that we have small and medium enterprises, and innovation-led entrepreneurship is something completely different. And Barry, I think to your point, some of the ecosystem that you're talking about is very much related to innovation-led entrepreneurship. And I think there are cities in America that have done really well to build out these ecosystems. And to Elizabeth's point, there are a lot of cities in America and areas in America that have not. And that is very much related to how conscious we are of the importance of building out an ecosystem. That has to be very intentional. I think that what happened in Silicon Valley with, you know, in order to have a vibrant ecosystem, you need risk capital, you need venture capital, you need good policy and regulations, you need a strong private sector, corporate sector to be able to absorb the innovations coming out and create that market. You need universities that are really pushing for R&D and embracing science and innovation on those campuses. But most importantly, you need entrepreneurs who have succeeded and who are graduating and who are really taking a leadership role to continue to support more and more entrepreneurs and bringing them into the ecosystem. And I think in emerging markets, we're seeing that start to happen in a much more rapid manner. And you know, Elizabeth has been writing about emerging markets for years and years, and I'm sure she has many amazing stories to tell. My point is, I think that there is a lot of opportunity right now in emerging markets. There are a lot of amazing things that are happening, a lot of technology and innovation that is coming out of these markets, as opposed to just, you know, normally we think, oh, all of the innovation is coming out of Silicon Valley or Boston or Singapore or Tel Aviv. We're seeing many other cities start taking the lead.
Thanks. Thank you, Dina. And certainly, you know, there's a few examples. I'm actually worried when you mentioned the governments are not solution. The IMF, you know, is giving debt, you know, or providing debt to nations that are already indebted, you know, settle with debt. And that's not a solution. You know, we need different solutions than that. And then an example of public-private cooperation is Colorado State, which is now led by governor, and before that was led by governor, both of them successful entrepreneurs. And you can just see how the state actually is set up, and that public-private cooperation is flourishing. Just to continue on the reel, so that we give chance to Eddie and Elizabeth, an ambassador, to complete their rounds. Eddie, so a couple questions for you. So you give us a little intro into IEEE Innovation Nation, but what are the main criteria you use when you're deciding which low GDP, we said low GDP, we should call them developing economies, to choose to implement this IEEE Innovation Nation model? And then after the initial introduction of these, the accelerators and workshops that you introduced, how do trainees carry on to engage others, and how do they bring them into that network?
Yeah, so the first one related to how we pick countries. So countries have an opportunity to apply, and we use IEEE's membership base as a starting point. We don't exclude individuals who are not IEEE members. In fact, I think in Bosnia, maybe only 2 out of our 55 participants this year are members of IEEE. But we want to show them that IEEE is an organization that is a home for them, that they can get resources from. And then whether they decide to become a member or not is a whole different criteria. But the basis of the criteria I mentioned earlier on is low GDP per capita, high youth unemployment in these, what Dina referred to as emerging markets, because they truly are emerging markets. There's so much exciting stuff going on there. And entrepreneurs that have, let's say, built up a portfolio of all these years are looking to these emerging markets because they are much more exciting and interesting now for them to have a bit of a dabble with, rather than looking at the markets that are so well established, because everyone's looking towards those markets. And so the way we pick these countries is on the basis of application. You have to have a strong volunteer base. The entire program is led by volunteers. There is absolutely no one's getting paid to do any of this stuff here, which means that we're driven by passion. And that passion also leads on to your second question, Ned, which is, you know, what happens when you graduate? And Dina mentioned that MIT has this, Legatum Center has this fellowship, and then you have these fellows who graduate. And what we expect, and I'm sorry if I'm presuming, Dina, but I'm sure they're close to that. What we're assuming is that these individuals who become fellows of our program and the MIT Legatum Center's program and so on, they become the leaders of tomorrow. And they carry this knowledge, and they are tasked with coaching, mentoring, let's say, paving the way for others to succeed in their particular endeavors in entrepreneurship. So what we're expecting, for example, from the 2020 cohort is that the 5 or 6 best graduates will also become not only fellows, but they'll become assistants in the program in 2021. And we're doing the same thing in Sri Lanka. We'll do the same thing in Jamaica and Malaysia and Pakistan and Central Africa, et cetera, because these are the carriers of knowledge. They're paving the way. They've got the beacon. And of course, they're bringing other people together. So it's about community building, like-minded people who will be able to support each other in those particular pathways. One of the most challenging things that I've seen in some of these emerging economies is that people often feel isolated. And I'm going to partly quote what the ambassador said in his TEDx talk, is that sometimes the ideas that you have and the way you think can make you feel very, very isolated in the community that you're growing up in. But thanks to the digital technology that we have available to us, you are now able to connect with people all over the world. So if you're a kid in Bosnia who's dreaming big, who's seen Elon Musk, and you think, geez, that's incredible, you know, I can see myself doing something like that one day. And you live in a small village where everyone's constantly telling you, you can't do that, you know, you've got these goats to look after here. You're immediately killing off any enthusiasm that that young person had, in particular minorities and women, et cetera, et cetera. Elizabeth talked about that a little bit earlier on. But now these individuals can connect globally. So my dream is that these young people in Bosnia can connect with their counterparts in Sri Lanka, in Jamaica, in Malaysia, et cetera, and build a global community that is truly understanding of their particular background and the resources that they have or don't have available to them, to be able to start scaling those initiatives, to be able to start growing those economies, and to have the global support that you need in order to be able to roll these initiatives out and make them successful. So that's the direction that we're heading in. It's a global community that we're building, and that global community will leverage its resources to pave the way for new economies to really sort of emerge and grow with the rest of the remaining world.
Right. Elizabeth, as an entrepreneur and a journalist, what insights can you offer about why women are so undercapitalized both in the US and internationally? And has the pandemic impacted this trend, especially for the early stage investments?
Wow. Okay. So that's a big question. I feel like before I answer it, I want to just take on a couple of assumptions that have been underlying our discussion, which I kind of strongly disagree with. And I preface this as a journalist by saying that I founded Times of Entrepreneurship really to be a competitor to the corporate view of business that's provided by most business publications like the Wall Street Journal. So I think this nuanced discussion that we're having about entrepreneurship, about entrepreneurs and who they are, this is really what's needed if we're going to drive economies and innovation. And it generally doesn't happen. So everyone here, I'm applauding for taking the issue on. But I think there are two big misperceptions that get applied to economic development in developing emerging markets. And they are, first of all, that Silicon Valley, which everyone holds up as the big model, was built by the private sector. And you just have to take that on, given the fire hose of funding that really propelled all that innovation through defense contracts. Lockheed Martin was Silicon Valley's largest employer in the middle of the 20th century. So that's one thing. And it's completely gotten lost kind of in the retelling of the Silicon Valley history. And I think if we want to spur innovation, we really have to look at government as the biggest source of that risk capital. And then the second thing that I think gets very muddy in this is the confusion of software as the only kind of innovation. Because I think if we're going to have a real conversation about entrepreneurship, we need to broaden the definition of innovation beyond software into biotech, into deep tech, clean tech. And I think we have to come to the fundamental conclusion that really we can't predict which entrepreneurs are going to produce the innovations that either drive change or drive economic growth. And maybe I'll just end and try and address your question, which is that I do think women now are beginning to lead the way in some of those longer term innovation development projects. When I do my reporting, I encounter women really working on the biggest issues in their particular cultures. For instance, I just did a story about a woman in Mexico City, a Legatum fellow, who has been on the founding team of a company that is much more innovative, I would say, around finance and capital than anything I've seen in the US. And I've been covering that for many years in the US. And I think the issue of getting capital to women is a really critical one, since they're both very entrepreneurial and I think tend to be willing to take on these bigger challenges. I think the biggest barrier, the research is pretty clear, right, is that well, the government funding is not, there's not enough of it, which would probably be more equitable. The venture capital world is hugely male, and all of the research shows it's just biased, right? That if you act feminine in a pitch, you're less likely to get funding. I don't know. I mean, most women, I think, can't help but be feminine, right? So these are fundamental and sort of structural issues, and I think they have to be accommodated in all of the efforts that we're making.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, I was just, I will be asking Dina to kind of expand on that in my next question for her. But before, Ambassador Nelson, still have you there?
Yes.
Great. So next question for you, Ambassador. Given what you learned from your time in Bosnia, how difficult it is for entrepreneurs there to be successful, and what more can the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina do to support them?
In my experience talking to entrepreneurs across the country, the obstacles are many. I think it begins with the lack of strategy, the lack of vision among the leaders here. I don't think anyone here is talking to Barry Shoup or people like him about what is the ecosystem that's needed to help enterprises launch and grow. So that's a fundamental challenge. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of the specific measures that leaders are failing to take here. There are also other factors that are where the ecosystem is weak. And one is that I hear about from especially young entrepreneurs is the lack of family support for the idea of entrepreneurship. During the 50 years of Yugoslavia, the economy was heavily dominated by large parastatal firms, paid quite well, didn't demand a lot of work. Today in Bosnia Herzegovina, many of them carry on these state-owned enterprises, or you hope to get a good job in the public administration, where again, you earn a better salary, you don't have to work too hard. So the idea of starting your own business, earning less, and having all that risk and responsibility many parents would say, "What? Are you crazy? Why would you want to do that?" And that's why initiatives like Eddie's and like Bold are so important, because how do you begin to build that community around these young people who are saying, I could take my idea, I want to try, and I want to make a run at this. So how do you build that community? How do you create that structure of mentors? I agree with Eddie that it needs to be mentors that come at this as volunteers who do this out of a sense of passion. So although the government here does little to encourage this ecosystem, there are a number of NGOs and private initiatives that are trying to stimulate it. I think that I'm listening to the conversation tonight. I'm wondering why are there successful entrepreneurs here? What are the positives of the ecosystem that Barry was talking about? And some of them are that it is a tremendously diverse country. It is there's a good quality of life here. There's a strong supportive education, excellent language skills, and a very good cost of living. But a very complex environment for doing business, very heavy payroll taxes, no forgiveness for startup firms. They're expected to meet the same requirements that a large, mature firm has to make. There's heavy enforcement, very opaque regulation. So again, that's why we are working hard to improve e-governance and tackle some of these regulations. Again, there's few countries that are as complex as this one. There's 14 governments before you even get to the municipal level. There are 14 governments in Bosnia and Herzegovina, from the state to the entity to the canton and a district. It's a very complex environment. So to get that government action, we work very closely with the IMF. The country does need financial support, and part of that is trying to get the IMF and the EU and other donors to introduce really smart conditionalities to compel reforms that the leaders are not otherwise willing to take, to create this better business environment that is so needed. And then also to start making some real investments in infrastructure. Bosnia is just now moving from 3G to 4G. Bosnia has some of the poorest operating airports in Europe. There's a lot of opportunity for infrastructure investment as well.
Thank you for that, Messer. So Dina, question for you. But before I ask you, just wanted to run through a few stats related to the question. Women in emerging markets are the fastest growing population of entrepreneurs. And in the next 5 years, the global incomes of women will grow from $13 trillion to $18 trillion. In 2028, women will control 75% of global discretionary spending. A 2018 study by Boston Consulting Group and Mass Challenge of 1,500 businesses that Mass Challenge backed since 2010 found that for every dollar of funding, startups founded by women generated 78 cents, while male-founded startups generated only 31 cents. Yet women only receive about 2.8%, depending on who you ask, of all venture capital globally. So it seems obvious that one of the most effective ways to accelerate economic growth would be in these emerging economies would be to increase the number of opportunities for women to succeed. So my question for you is, how does Legatum Center specifically help women in developing economies achieve some of these goals?
We actually don't have any women-specific programs at the Legatum Center, and I hope that we never do have women-specific programs. I think, in light of all the statistics that you highlighted, it remains an anomaly as to why we continue to struggle to see capital flow to women entrepreneurs, right? And Elizabeth talked a little bit about why that is, and a lot of it is structural and related to bias. At the Legatum Center, I think our goal is to shed as much light and create as much awareness on how successful women entrepreneurs are, and also how much capital needs to flow towards these women entrepreneurs. And I think you saw the panel that we did on Women Entrepreneurship Day, which really looked into I would say last year we saw an increase in the amount of venture capital, a very slight increase in the amount of venture capital go up, and then we saw a decline again. And I think that decline is very much related to COVID. The women have paid a price during the global pandemic because they continue to be the main caregivers. They continue to carry the brunt of the responsibilities at home while at the same time running businesses. And, you know, I think a lot of these issues need to be tackled at a structural level, and the Legatum Center will always work to highlight that and create awareness around that. But I think until we stop the overall discourse of, you know, focusing on women entrepreneurs like they're this unique, I almost want to say this, you know, where, as Elizabeth said, women can't help but be feminine when making a pitch. But also, I sometimes feel that when we think of women entrepreneurs, we think, oh, look, that's so cute. That's a woman entrepreneur. When in actuality, you know, women perform at a much higher level, as you said, than male entrepreneurs. And if anything, I think during COVID, all the women entrepreneurs that I have seen have demonstrated enormous resilience. And I think early in the pandemic, I joked around a little bit with Elizabeth because in the early days of the pandemic, you'd often see articles from investors giving advice to entrepreneurs on how they can survive the pandemic. And a lot of it had to do with being conservative with cash, on, you know, being very focused on creating a stellar team, and so forth and so on. And I thought, and I would say to Elizabeth, you know, women have been doing this for years. You know, I am a woman, I am a female entrepreneur as well. And, you know, as all the women entrepreneurs that I know were doing that from the get-go. But yet investors never showed interest. But I do want to say that on the flip side, I do think that oftentimes, and this is also a structural issue, oftentimes women entrepreneurs, they don't pitch to venture capitalists, or they don't go and apply for a loan. And that is very much related to women, unless they meet 100% of the criteria, they won't go for the pitch. The cost of failure for women is much higher than it is for men, and that is very much, again, related to structural issues and biases. Men feel very comfortable making a pitch to a venture capitalist, even if they don't meet all the criteria required by that venture capitalist, or even if their idea isn't necessarily one that will be viable or that will be able to scale. Women, on the other hand, won't do that. So I think the Legatum Center and MIT, I think, and in general at Sloan right now, we're big believers in the importance of inclusive economic growth. Women are part of that equation, and until we see investors not only, it's very much a leadership decision, not only think about how they make their investments and who they make their investments in, but even within their portfolios to really think about how they can create gender diversity within the companies they invest in. I don't think we're going to see those numbers really shift in any significant way. And I think we all have a responsibility to continue to draw attention, not to make it seem that women entrepreneurs are, you know, this anomaly. They are not. They have been around for decades. They are amazing as male entrepreneurs. I just think that we need to lead differently.
Very extensive answer. So let's go into a little bit more into an open discussion. So I will ask some questions from audience, as well as some of the questions that I've been jotting down and wanting to ask, you know, based on our discussion. So one of the things we talked about is that we have this notion, I think few panelists touched on this, that the United States is this role model for entrepreneurship, and we just talked about how other nations are doing just fine, and they have obviously very specific conditions in their countries. And we also talked about how some of these countries we can learn from. We have lots of different formats for initiating innovation and entrepreneurship through both short-term form engagements such as hackathons, pitches, startup showcases, etc. And also long form such as accelerators can take weeks or months, incubators, etc. What have you seen work best in developing? What works best in these developing emerging markets? What combination or maybe one of these works the best in engaging entrepreneurs and building and building the ecosystem? Anybody?
Well, I can answer for a story that actually I was just working on today, which is about a program called Entrepreneurship for All, which was started by Desh Deshpande, who's a famous telecom entrepreneur. He's on the board at MIT. And he founded this organization called E4All. And it does a couple of things that I think are notable. One is that it offers entrepreneurship training in the language that is in the community, which you would think would be obvious, but is not. I've seen in a lot of places in emerging markets that the entrepreneurship training is unfortunately aimed at the elites of the society, which is why it's so cool to hear about the work that Eddie's doing. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about Entrepreneurship for All is the length of time for the program. It's a year long. It's entirely free. And it engages 3 mentors to kind of go through the program with 12 entrepreneurs. So I think the idea is that both sides are transformed in that experience, which kind of goes to what we're talking about with the structural transformations that need to happen to really encourage entrepreneurship. The people who have power, whether it's given to them by virtue of their birth or race or class, the bigger thing that needs to happen to really spur entrepreneurship is probably a transformation in the people who have power versus the people that we want to be the entrepreneurs.
Anyone else wants to expand on this?
Yeah, Ned, I can comment on that. Maybe I can just give an example of Bosnia, and then people can look at that and how it's applied to other countries. So one thing that I've found that is one of the biggest strengths, and the ambassador mentioned, is this diaspora component. So I'm not attempting to build the ecosystem on my own, far from that. So I don't want anyone thinking that I'm attempting to solve the unsolvable. But I'm trying to, with my team, foster that early stage educational piece that's so vital in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Because what I've noticed going back 5 years when I first started doing this thing in Bosnia, is that there were already a few accelerators, incubators, companies that were willing to invest, foreign investment, but there was very little work being done at that grassroots level. So I attempted to try and transform the education piece to be more in line with what's expected from the market. And that is, why isn't anyone teaching innovation, entrepreneurship, and the tools at formal educational institutions? Now, you could find a little bit of that in faculties of economy at various universities, but very little in the STEM domain. And so naturally, a lot of the innovation that we're seeing today comes from that particular domain. But very little knowledge is built within the faculty. So we attempted to change that by bringing together, I believe, 62 or 63 deans of various technical faculties in Bosnia. Believe it or not, there are 60 something in a small country like that, which is another thing which is very challenging, that the quality is dispersed in different institutions. But what we saw is a lot of resistance from these institutions to want to teach that. And the common question was, why should we be teaching or even giving our students an opportunity to learn about innovation and entrepreneurship? We are technical faculties. So there's a mindset that needs to be also changed in order for this, let's say, flourishing environment to start developing. And we're slowly starting to change that environment by engaging diaspora. So Bosnia has 2 million plus diaspora. Many of them are very, very successful. Many of them are in the US. And so what we're doing is we're tapping into their know-how from those different epicenters of entrepreneurial activity and trying to pour back into the country. Because I truly believe that local patriotism, although some people might frown upon it, is one of the keys to driving prosperity in these emerging economies. Because if people are not willing to put their time and effort in just because they want to help, and there are people that do that, then people certainly have a level of local patriotism that they will put their time and effort in behind. And I'm trying to exploit that, if lightly said, by making sure that these individuals who have a lot of knowledge, who have built up wealth, who have had a life of perhaps some privilege, can now give back to these communities where they originally come from, whether it's first, second, or third generation, and help build that knowledge, that capacity to do things. And I think the same can be applied to my colleagues in Sri Lanka and many other countries that we're working with, that they also have this enormous diaspora that is somehow being, tapped into, but not to the point where it's really going to, tip over and start really producing the ecosystem that needs to be developed in those countries. So I'm trying to do that from a grassroots perspective by tapping into this pipeline of knowledge that we have globally and diversity built up in that sense. And just to go back to Dina's point as well, I think one very good point she made is that women don't like to be referred as women entrepreneurs. Our 2017 president of IEEE, Karen Bartison, actually said, "I hate being referred to as a female engineer or a woman in engineering. I'm an engineer. I am a woman. I know that I'm a woman. You don't need to specifically highlight that every time you say I'm an engineer. I want to be recognized as an engineer, not as a woman engineer." So I think that is also an important aspect. And I'll highlight that in our program, 61% of participants are women in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we didn't do anything specific to target women. As Dina also said, we don't have something specific that targets women, but you have good leadership and you have good examples of women doing great things. There's a natural tendency that other women will see that I can do that, I can be there. There's a support structure for me. And we're very proud of that particular fact, even though that's not something that we set out to do. We also focus on that regional component by building pockets of excellence in small rural parts of the country. And that also helps with, getting rid of some of that urbanization that's going on in big cities, that everyone's flocking to the capital city because that's where the action is. With the digital tools available to us today, I think the ecosystem no longer has to be concentrated in a particular geographic location that's, briefly defined by the borders of a particular city or municipality. It can be a distributed model because the resources are available to everyone in that particular sense.
All right, I have some more questions from the audience. So there's a couple questions, maybe we can put them together. So excluding a few overnight success stories, it takes startups, realistically 10, 20 years to reach success, right? So one question is, how are these programs that we just talked about equipped to continue to support entrepreneurs and sustain the ecosystem that's essential for their nurture? We talked about the importance of that ecosystem and connections. And the other is about the government. How can we incentivize governments who often think very short term, think of them like being very short term investors, that run on like whatever 2-4 year cycles, to invest in innovation and entrepreneurship that takes a very long time, like I mentioned, 10 to 20 year time span. So anyone?
I think when it comes to government, and I'll speak more to emerging markets, where I'm from, the Middle East and also Africa in general, we have one of the largest youth populations in the world, and youth unemployment is at an all-time high. So for us in emerging markets, and specifically in the Middle East and also in Africa more broadly, job creation is critical to our survival. And I think, I often say that the Middle East is home to a generation in waiting, and those jobs are not going to be created without entrepreneurship and innovation, and governments know that. And what we're seeing is more and more governments changing regulations, creating enabling environments to support startups and business creation. I think what we need to see more of is what is what Elizabeth talked a little bit about, and I think others also mentioned, which is the role that governments can play in increasing risk capital. And I think that's a critical element, but also the role that governments can play in supporting research and development is extremely critical to our ability to increase innovation in our markets. So I do think that governments have a big role to play in terms of regulations, but also in terms of investments as well. And that is happening. We're seeing this happen in a lot of markets. We need to see it happen. We need to see more of it happen. And I think also in terms of just more broadly, ecosystems thriving, I said this before, and I do strongly believe in this. I think it really depends on those who have successfully created startups that have grown and scaled. They also need to become core parts of seeing that ecosystem grow and thrive. So, and there are so many entrepreneurs that I know of who have been critical to supporting entrepreneurship and innovation growth as an ecosystem, who were entrepreneurs, who were very successful, who were able to grow and scale their businesses, and who now take a leadership role in seeing that ecosystem develop and thrive. And I'm sure Elizabeth probably has more to add to that, just from the number of entrepreneurs that she's interviewed over the years who are playing those leadership roles.
Yeah, actually, they're the best. I've interviewed so many. In fact, I think most of the innovative finance comes from people who were entrepreneurs and then became investors, right? Because, and when you were talking, Dean, I was just thinking that issue of time is just one of the fundamental issues. I remember interviewing Fadi Yandour when he was starting out as an investor, shifting from really being a great entrepreneur and the founder of Aramex. And I just remember him telling me I could never have done this if the IFC wasn't patient capital, right? They were the first few $1,000,000 into one of his fund, and they said, okay, we don't need to see returns for 10 years. Or it was maybe even longer, 15 or 20 years. I think there is a limit to the role that government can play, because governments have limited budgets. And I know this is a difficult proposition, but to some extent, this question of speed is really driven by the demands of the wealthy, right? Because they're the LPs in the private equity funds and in the less private equity and more in venture capital, but in many other kinds of capital, right? It's wealthy families, it's wealthy individuals, really kind of that have grown up in that Milton Friedman style of capitalism that says it's okay to be only profit driven, and it's short-term profits at that, right? That's the best way to run the world. We kind of need a big rethink of that, and I think that leadership has to come from the wealthy sector in a lot of economies. I see there might be responses to that on our panel. I hope so.
From the ambassador and general as well on the government issue.
So I guess one of the things that I would say is as I had the opportunity to travel the world as the IEEE president, and with my interest in innovation, I had the opportunity to open doors to heads of states and others, and the countries that I was most impressed with had, in some cases at the governmental level, they understood that innovation, of itself is kind of the economic engine. It generates jobs for young people, it does other kinds of things. But as was just said, governments have limited resources that they can apply. The ones that I was most impressed with were the ones that applied those resources in a way to, in some cases, fund universities and fund those research kinds of areas. But they also then leveraged and linked that deliberatively to linking it to industry. And so both small industry startups as well as mid-size and large size. And so they were, as a government, they were able to leverage both the government funding, but also industrial funding in that to actually increase that capital.
Okay. But we're kind of over an hour into discussion, so I'd like to wrap up. There's many other questions, but time has passed, and I'd like to, at the end, give each of the panelists an opportunity to maybe leave a word of advice to our entrepreneurs, all the audience, everyone that's watching, and maybe something, a word of hope and advice. Given what's going on with the COVID, we cannot ignore that. And you know, a lot of entrepreneurs we talk about have a lot of challenges, especially women. And so, if everyone could take a turn, maybe you can start with, you know, say Dina, and go down the line, and just the last parting words and advice.
I think if I were to give any parting words, it would be that I think for those out there who have stepped up to start a business and who are really working hard to create an innovation-led enterprise, this is your time. So I think if anything, the global pandemic has revealed to us not just gaps in healthcare as a system, but gaps in almost every single system that touches our lives. And this is not something that is unique to emerging markets. These are global challenges. And I think if I were to say anything, is that there's so much that needs to be solved, which means there's so much opportunity for innovators out there. And governments cannot do it on their own anymore. And the private sector as it exists today, we know that they need to change. So, and for systems to change, that really needs to happen bottom up. So I think for everyone out there who is starting a business, this is your time. I would really own it and really think about how you can drive and change and transform the systems that we have now seen to be largely dysfunctional.
Elizabeth?
My words of advice are kind of twofold. I would say broaden your definition of success. I think a lot of young people starting, or older people starting, thinking about starting businesses, don't do it because it feels like somehow it is stepping outside the safe zone of what we define as success today. But I would just say broaden your definition of success, because I can say the older that I've gotten, the happier I've been when I just kind of looked around at what made me happy and not what the world defined as success. And the second piece of that is that everybody fails. So if failure is holding you back in some way, just forget about it, right? Because the people who claim they didn't fail are lying. And the best people, the best entrepreneurs, in fact, are so thrilled to tell you about all the times they screwed up, because that's part of the process, right? And that's how you move forward. And failure actually can be sort of fun. I mean, you get an early sting from it, and then you're like, whoa, I get to start over, right? And do something different and new.
The ambassador, do you have any closing parting words for entrepreneurs?
What comes to mind for me, one is to encourage everyone who's joined us tonight to stay connected. What motivated you to join this discussion tonight, I think I see as a real positive, that idea that you want to hear how others are coming together to nurture good ideas, or whether you're on the demand side or the supply side. That reaching out and being open to connecting, that's the fundamental part of this ecosystem of successful entrepreneurialism that we're all trying to promote. And then I also think often, especially in this country, about resilience and adaptability. I find that people in Bosnia Herzegovina, over centuries of living a tough life here on the overlap of the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian empires, we're constantly learning to adapt and to be resilient. And that seems to come through for the entrepreneurs, especially when they join the 2 million who have left the country and suddenly are very successful. So that resilience and adaptability is truly being put to the test across the globe by the COVID pandemic. And that's where entrepreneurs succeed. That's where they find opportunities to move forward. So I see that here, and I see that shared among all entrepreneurs, and it's a time to reflect and embrace that.
Thank you, Master. Carol, next. Anybody last word for entrepreneurs? Gemma Shoup.
I'm sorry, I try to go by Barry. So I guess two comments. First, you know, we're living in quite awful times, you know, with the pandemic and everything else that's going on in the world. And I just want to remind people that oftentimes from adversity come the hugest opportunities. And so there's out of this, there are going to come some great opportunities. And so just look for those opportunities. And the second, anybody that knows me fairly well knows that I am a huge fan of diversity in innovation and entrepreneurship. And I don't mean just traditional diversity, I mean diversity in its broadest sense. So as you practice, as you engage in trying to innovate and trying to develop new ideas, don't forget that there's other lenses to look at the problem through, and you can gain so much insight from those additional lenses to make the end product even better.
Thank you. And Eddie, can you close?
I'll try and keep it short, given that we've only got 2 minutes left. So my brother and I started our first unofficial business when we were 7 or 8 years old as refugees in Switzerland. And for me, that has stayed with me for a very long time. Obviously, I remember the details of that. But a lot of people get into innovation entrepreneurship because they want to solve a problem. But inadvertently, when you ask young people, I want to have independence of income, I want to be wealthy, I want to live a good lifestyle. And I can well and truly say that once you get to a certain point in your life, I'm now 36, with 37 early next year, money is no longer the driver for you as a young person, because once you achieve a certain level of wealth, you then want to give back. So what I'm always appealing to people who have set up their lives and are relatively comfortable is start working towards making sure that these neighbors, these communities that you're in, the communities that are outside of your reach, also are able to achieve a meaningful life. And that really means we all have to be leaders of tomorrow. We have to contribute back to society. And innovation entrepreneurship, for me, are the drivers of this particular independence, financial independence. So I will continue to strive to work with young people in Bosnia and the world. And I really look forward to engaging with others who are on this call to see what else we can do to expand these programs and provide that independence and security for the emerging markets.
Thank you. I'd like to close and say that I'm deeply grateful to all of you panelists and the team at MIT Enterprise Forum of New York City who made all this possible. And of course, I want to thank everyone in the audience from all over the world tonight watching. So with that, thank you and have a good night.
Thank you. You're so nice. Thank you.
Thank you.